When I thought about speaking to you on a listening church, I couldn't help wondering where to start. Even the concept of listening seemed a little tricky to conceptualize. After all, is listening about the passive act of hearing every spoken word, paying attention through our body language, posture, focus, and gestures, and responding when asked a question? Is that listening? It sounds a little passive to me. After all, even ChatGPT will listen to me, ready to respond to anything I might throw its way. It may listen and even respond, but perhaps we can all agree there's much more to listening than that relatively passive approach. So, is listening about doing something and taking action based on what you hear? So if you listen, perhaps in the way I described earlier, by paying attention and showing you're paying attention by asking questions and clarifying in return. Aha, now we're getting closer to the truth we all seek, because listening is undoubtedly about our interaction with each other. We're starting to get more human now. So, how do we approach this topic a little more theologically? I thought of exploring things by returning to the concept of childlike wonder and taking it to some of the most human people I know, my children. Funnily enough, they seemed familiar with what listening meant, and most of that was based around the preconceptions one would have of a student and teacher in a classroom. We face the front, we don't talk out of turn, and we act respectfully, they said. But they didn't know what a listening church meant. In the end, we settled on a statement. What we do in youth group, where we talk about something important, and we all get to say what we think. I'll return to this a little later. Father Kentenich was famed by many for listening. When we visited the original Schoenstatt, I saw the room where he stayed as a priest. It's preserved now, pretty much as he lived in it, but you cannot see from the pictures that the rear window was high off the ground because the building was on a slope. And yet, despite that barrier, he still made himself available to listen to whoever sought his counsel. He didn't hide, he didn't tell people that he was too busy for them or too important to hear what they had to say. Not only that, he could even have been said to welcome people when he occasionally gave out sweets. That would not have been an easy thing to do in the Germany of his time. When he was imprisoned by the SS during World War II in a solitary confinement cell in the cold, dark, cramped space, he could be heard singing. Was that listening? I would say it was, because this place was designed to break you. Singing in such places was so out of character. If you sing, it indicates that Father Kentenich was listening to something unique and reacting to what he heard. I believe that Father Kentenich was sharing a message. He was listening to something and then relaying it to us all. These thoughts were clarified by Pope Francis in his message for World Day of Social Communications. He said, "Communicating means sharing, and sharing demands listening and acceptance. Listening is much more than simply hearing. Hearing is about receiving information, while listening is about communication and calls for closeness. Listening allows us to get things right, and not simply to be passive onlookers, users, or consumers. Listening also means being able to share questions and doubts, to journey side by side, to banish all claims to absolute power, and to put our abilities and gifts at the service of the common good." Now, if we expand on that, we could gain further guidance from Laudato Si, where Pope Francis wrote, "Nature is filled with words of love, but how can we listen to them amid the constant noise, interminable and nerve-wracking distractions, or the cult of appearances? Many people today sense a profound imbalance which drives them to frenetic activity and makes them feel busy, in a constant hurry which leads them to ride roughshod over everything around them. I want to be careful. It's easy to state a quote and take it out of context, and I don't want to do that, especially today, because I want to listen to the learned voices around us and apply their context and meaning. When Pope Francis wrote those words, he referred to a creator whose presence must not be contrived but found. And that was in turn a thought from his apostolic exhortation in Evangelii Gaudium. These are the most important words I've contemplated in a long time. I'll repeat them. A creator whose presence must not be contrived, but found. To find God's presence, not to contrive him. It reminds me of how we relate to our Blessed Mother in the shrine. Nothing without you, nothing without us. We find her presence with us, and she, in turn, sees us waiting with her. Nothing is manufactured. It's simply expressing an act of mutual love. We are already moving away from the passive act of simply hearing words, which is the base concept of the intransitive verb listen. I started talking about that, but now we're exploring what it means to communicate, to take action, share, and very importantly, make time to think about what we hear in today's world. But let me pause for a moment, because among the people I work with daily are many who cannot speak words. Hearing is not just what we do with our ears. It is what we do with our hearts, eyes, and senses, both natural and supernatural. I can have a long conversation with someone without them having to utter or sign a single word. So remember that listening is all about the world around us, people, events, messages, and acts of love. As Pope Francis said, we must discern the messages. We must perceive from what may look attractive, beguiling, or otherwise magnetic. Don't let that modern world steal our thoughts and attention from what we must focus on. There is something in that for everyone, no matter what your situation. Now I feel ready to confront the thought of a listening church. This is an active church, not a passive one. A church of people who do not sit back passively, but go out and seek the truth, to do good things in their life every day and go out of their way to discover and celebrate holiness. But let me challenge you in that, because we must also learn to be a little uncomfortable. I cannot imagine Jesus was comfortable engaging with Zacchaeus, the tax collector, in Luke 19. Doesn't seem that Zacchaeus was comfortable, and not even the disciples were particularly pleased about it. But despite appearances, history, social class, and everything else that appeared so wrong on the surface, there was listening. We don't shut people out because of differences. We engage. I know it is idealistic of me to say that, but engagement is what starts the conversation. Therefore, we come to the notion of the listening church. By now, you've come on a journey with me about listening. When I was in the original Schoenstatt, there was a place called Mount Tabor, and I was told Fr Kentenich often walked in the forest just to listen to God. Fr Kentenich didn't forget the importance of realizing that sometimes the most important voice may speak rather quietly, and we need to make time for that. If I am to leave you with one thought, I've been studying how our brains deal with sound in the auditory cortex, somewhere here and a bit in. But there are 4 other critical areas with what we hear that deal with what we hear. And more intricately than that, They all play together in a pulsating symphony of electricity. The crossover between them encompasses so many other senses, paralleled by my description of how we listen to people even when there are no audible words. We don't just hear, we also feel, imagine, engage, and remember. If we imagine our brain as an analogy for the church, then a listening church is something we all need to be part of. It isn't for clergy, it's for everyone. We all listen because we all have a part to play, and we all take up the challenge of what we discern. That, my friends, is what a listening church does. I have a few questions for you to think about. Number one, what barriers prevent us from listening with our whole being, and how can we overcome them? Number two, what does listening mean to you, and who do you feel you should listen to more? 3, how might we listen with our hearts, and how is that different from listening with our mind? And lastly, number 4, are there messages that you might be hearing that are daunting? How might you respond to those messages more practically?